will be presenting a paper entitled Women's Passionate Mobility in Colonial Spaces, 1919 to 1948, or How Non-State Actors Shaped Their Migrations. Jennifer is an associate professor of French, Francophone Studies, and History at Penn State University. Jennifer's work has appeared in many journals, including Signs, Historical Reflections, French Historical Studies, Gender and History, French Politics, Culture and Society, and French Colonial History. In 2010, she published Colonial Metropolis, The Urban Grounds of Feminism and Anti-Imperialism in Interwar Paris with the University of Nebraska Press. She's working on a new project about women writers and the French Empire in the period of the World Wars. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. And thank you to all those who organized this. When I first met John, behind him on the wall was the Michigan football poster, the first time I'd ever seen such a thing in a professor's office, and quite reassuring since I like to watch sports myself, although I remain a rugby fan. I will stick with that. He also insisted from the moment we met that I call him John, which others have mentioned. And for the next 6 years as a graduate student, which he may or may not know, I did everything in my power not to call him Professor Merriman or John. My French upbringing just wouldn't let me call him John, and instead I spent 6 years not calling him by any name whatsoever, which is incredibly difficult for the record. I saw him as brilliant, I saw him as my advisor, but he's in fact, of course, one of the most gracious and modest people I have ever worked with. Take the year he placed four students in tenure-track positions simultaneously in French history, in Middle Eastern history, and in my case, in a French department. He would never brag about that, although you should. But he can make that sort of thing happen because he doesn't pretend to know all things about all topics, and he welcomed those of us, as Dan just showed us as well, who strayed far afield into things like the Arab world or race and gender. What he does do is give vague instructions like, after my first chapter was about 4 months overdue, why don't you get me 10 pages by, say, 2 weeks from now? Which, of course, I immediately panicked and wrote 85 and handed them to him 2 weeks later. So it worked, right? He knew who to connect us with in our fields. Always and inevitably someone as generous as him with their mentoring and their advising. And he pushed us to write clearly, to be curious, to be extremely independent, and possibly slightly obsessed with research and the archives. From the very first Richard Cobb article he assigned us to the first time we met over a verre, always near an archive somewhere in France. So keep in mind as I go forward with this talk 2 other things. In the Tour de France, an article by Richard Cobb called Danton 40-75, where Richard Cobb is in fact describing a woman's laundry line in the courtyard, and at first she has sort of plain underwear, and then it becomes sort of lingerie, and then it becomes men's underwear, so keep that in mind, because I learned about that because of John. And second of all, keep in mind that he never taught a class undergraduate or graduate without novels, albeit not the novel that I'm about to talk to you about in this talk. I'm telling you all of this because in some ways the research I'm about to share might seem nothing like John's. But it is, because he taught me to be compassionate and passionate in pursuing people and their stories, no matter how fragmented, through the archives, to think about the ways in which they inhabited and resisted their times, how they angered the French state, and their capacity for resisting marginalization. Now let me turn to women in French Indochina and French West Africa who did all of those things and more. I'm like a mad woman lost in the world. That's not me, that's my quote. Although sometimes I am like a mad woman lost in the world. Separated from my honorable friendship with whom I dreamed of realizing one day my dream. If there's still possibility to marry the one who is half of my life, and also the one who was years in danger, rightly under the authority of the armies, in my despair, Sir Minister of the Colonies, do not refuse me, I beg of you. These are extracts from Mademoiselle Marlette's 1946 letter to the Minister of the Colonies, and they're particularly moving and intimate, but also rare, because here you have a white woman who speaks openly of her desire and love for a black man in her own voice, not a spy's report, and also not a transcription of a conversation. And she does so in order to request something from the French state, which is free passage to Africa. Her French is somewhat disjointed, and she's not always grammatically correct, so her background was no doubt popular. Moreover, she cannot quite control the rawness of her emotions, the messiness that undergirds her request. Still, she understands her role as supplicant, and knows enough of the codes of the administration from which she wants something to emphasize that hers is an honorable relationship. She's not a prostitute, is what she's saying. She does not use the word love, but she expresses emotions of pain and pleasure, hope and despair that are often associated with love. She is one of many women who found their own words to articulate desire and love in ways that challenge social and state-regulated forms of propriety. They did so not only in novels where one might expect to find such things, but also in archives, and more specifically in letters to the French colonial administration. So in the chapter from which this talk is drawn, I developed the concept of what I call passionate mobility. In other words, how women use sentiments, words, and acts of sex and love to fuel their colonial mobility. Although I discuss some published texts, non-state actors drive this talk in my book with their non-literary forms of expression. Why passion? As Sarah Ahmed reminds us, and I quote, "It is significant that the word passion and the word passive share the same root in the Latin word for suffering, passio." As they wrote to administrators about their desire for colonial mobility, women often constructed themselves as passive by emphasizing their need for the interlocutor's strength, which included money, funds, that kind of thing. This helped them to move about the empire, so mulatto begs something of the minister. They simultaneously played up their passionate needs, so mulatto is mad and lost and dreaming. Their passion, passive play, is emblematic of how women deployed what were more often perceived as weaknesses, being female and filled with illogical or crazy emotions. See the recent Serena Williams ad for Nike, to get a modern day example of this, by the way. And this allows them to achieve mobility. By speaking of everyday experiences as affective, they became effective, taking what control they could over their situations. So in the drafty book from which this talk is drawn, I trace such intimacies in order to understand what happens when French women, two categories that I push and prod, challenge the imperial policing of their intimate lives. Intimacy then has at least three meanings here. Individual voices in the archives, personal, often informal writing, often spontaneous writing, and the private details of women's lives, choices, bodily self-awareness, and rebellion. The women I study have in common that they bear the limits of policing intimacy. The administration's options for intervention were actually limited. With a few exceptions, it could not physically force women's movements, but it could try to track and dissuade them. So the state literally tracked vice overseas, and sometimes in France, of course, but certainly overseas, via a certificate of good life and morals, the Certificat de bonne vie et mœurs. Women needed this physical document to find work, to get married, and to request government funds. But how does one certify that a human being is of good life and morals? By asking their neighbors. So the formula, good life and morals, then, was really about determining a woman's degree of vice. In other words, her non-normative, extramarital, and potentially paid sexual proclivities and other bad habits. Officials relied upon salacious rumors to evaluate women's relative badness. Indeed, gossip, rumor, and scandal functioned together as a sort of unofficial colonial vice squad, tracking and sanctioning purportedly bad women. Le sergent aurait eu avec elle des relations intimes, the sergeant allegedly had intimate relations with her, is a very common phrase in police reports. But how often do we think about its grammatical construction? It's an allegation of an intimate deviation from propriety, but those writing the reports could rarely be certain, so they used the conditional mode to signal that they in fact had no real way of knowing what that woman had actually done with that sergeant. On an affective level, the real problem of the color line overseas, as Karina Ray has pointed out, was that the European scramble for such massive chunks of territory in the late 19th century, quote, entailed serious risks to European supremacy, because white colonizers and settlers were stretched very thin across the global south. The numbers-based potential for loss of control over massive regions led to a policy shift away from ignoring or even encouraging affective and economic ties between colonizers and colonized via partnerships and marriages. Instead, governments started to actively dissuade white men from concubinage in both French Indochina and French West Africa, and to fixate in a panic upon the so-called métis question, which was the outcome either forced or chosen of such encounters. That turn away from concubinage made white women a precious commodity for anyone seeking status within the administration or settler communities overseas. Yet simultaneously, white women started traveling independently in greater numbers throughout the empire and had the opportunity to connect with African and Indo-Chinese men. Thus, by 1943, and this is just one example, there were 59 so-called mixed marriages in Saigon alone, 8 of which involved European women with Vietnamese men. The color line, noted by W.E.B. Du Bois, played a role in such stories because just as administrators were attempting to shore up white prestige by putting an end to interracial relationships, white women were upending that strategy by falling in love or lust with men of color. One result was that administrators assumed of sex in the color line that, and I quote, wives of colonial soldiers, present or absent, almost all indulge in prostitution. A convenient way of arguing that no white woman pursuing reunification with a man of color was respectable, which had as a logical continuation that her passion should not be taken seriously. So having contextualized it for you, let me give you a few final cases of passionate mobility. Paulette wrote several letters in relatively poor French explaining that she had met Albert while he was in captivity and then hosted him in 1944 after what she called the invasion, but I assume she meant the liberation of France. She used the word invasion. Quote, "This encounter resulted in the declaration of our loves, from where I have a child currently 15 months old. Declaration of our loves was code for the physical acts that engendered a child. But her use of the plural, our loves, is also important because it reflects a layering of passions, both affective and physical, and because it's a good example of how cognizant women were of the importance of mentioning love as opposed to lust as the force impelling their intimate encounters. Love, the stuff of affect, was more respectable, but was also no doubt something that women such as Paulette really felt as part of their sex lives. Paulette had met Albert in 1941 when Germans organized a camp for 3,500 British citizens, and African POWs were brought in to serve as the sort of maintenance crew for that camp. And two men claimed to have crossed paths with Paulette at that time. One was Albert, who became the father of a daughter named Micheline. The other one was Ignace. As the father, Albert was granted permission to demobilize in France if he so chose. Meanwhile, Ignace was attempting to woo Paulette while accusing Albert of stealing his fiancée from him by making her believe that he was dead, that he had died. Administrators soon became really unnerved, just as you're probably confused, by her multiple relationships. I quote, "It seems to me thus preferable to limit to the strict minimum the administration's intervention in this very unclear affair because of its intimate character. They suspected that she'd take any man to care for her child, but also insisted that, quote, we cannot contest her freedom to choose between her two suitors." But was material support for her child really her primary motivation? It seems not. Ignace actively sought to fill the role of husband, but Paulette kept rejecting him and just wanted our loves with Albert. In 1947 and 1948, almost 4 years later, she was still writing to ask for Albert's return to the metropole, restating for interlocutors his rather unlikely claims that he couldn't find any space on any of the steamships from Africa to France. Eventually, her letters fizzled out, with administrators astutely deducing in their asides that it did not seem he necessarily wanted to reunite with her. So in her case, colonial mobility had failed, but not because the administration refused to help her. In fact, her passionate pleas had functioned. It's just that the man she wanted to be with was not in agreement with her. So to build towards a conclusion, let me tell you of one 14-year-old orphan in French Indochina who raised such scandal with a married man with whom reports claimed she was infatuated that the police had to intervene. The story resurfaced years later when she was engaged to marry a lieutenant whose father had heard of the rumors and wanted to dissuade his son who, quote, and these are the father's words, blinded by the passion she was able to awaken in him, has not taken to date my advice. In this case, the police report cautioned that her youthful indiscretion with a much older man whose age made him the blamable one. And this, by the way, for those who know this period, it's very rare for a woman to get a pass just because she's 14 years old and the man is older. So this is a somewhat exceptional reading of that kind of a situation. But in any case, that it was not, in fact, something that should be used against her now. The potential father-in-law read his son's passion as weakness, the woman's provocation of said passion as a serious threat to his family. Today I've shown that it was not because women in the archives did not have the elegant words of novelists that they did not invoke similar passions, which is one reason thinking of state-run archives as merely one segment of a more far-reaching archive, one that includes, I'd say, novels and theory, is so useful. After all, perhaps the most famous articulations of desire said in this period are those of another teenage girl, namely Marguerite Duras's fictional embodiment. She wrote explicitly of her own fictionalized erotic past, in particular of her sexual experiences with her lover, whose racial identity shifts slightly through each of her novels. With him, at first, she feels, and I quote, and this is my own translation because I don't really like the other translations, she feels, quote, pain, and then after that pain is taken, in turn it is changed, slowly torn away, swept into pleasure, embraced into it, the sea without form, simply incomparable. Her first orgasm with a man, and possibly, she hints, her first orgasm ever. Written much later, fictionalized, Duras's is nonetheless at some level a story of her lived experience of adolescence in French Indochina. And like many archival stories, hers is also a story of desire in which race, class, and gender all played a part. A wealthy older Chinese man and a poor but white girl. Moreover, if her novels mostly emphasize sex in relation to material comforts, money, at the very end of this novel, she actually says, and I quote, that she's not so sure that she had not loved him with a love that she hadn't seen. Like many of the women in my longer chapter, Duras held power, including of the power of her lover's desire for her and the power to sway an audience with her passions. And this is my conclusion here. Eugénie Baron also had that sort of clout, but you've probably never heard of her. She snuck her way into French Indochina via ship's bowels in the believable stories she told authorities upon arrival to find her husband, but in truth to reunite with her lover. Once that companionship came to an end, police claimed that she had, quote, frequented not without profit indigents and European soldiers in Caubang. They also claimed that what they termed her charms literally started a riot. Quote, the day before her departure, at night, the door of the house in which she was staying was assailed by a gang of aroused soldiers. The French word was excité, which police had to disperse. Surveillance concluded that she was indésirable, a term for those who were so unwelcome overseas that if at all legally possible, they should be expulsed. If technically accurate, the term undesirable seems a bit of a misnomer for a woman like Baron, who in fact was so desirable that men stormed her dwelling. And that was the crux of the passionate mess of colonial mobility. The most desirable and desiring women were undesirable in the eyes of the state, and yet they found ways to pursue their passions. I am like a mad woman or our loves. These phrases are not as explicit or as poetic as Duras's the sea, without form, simply incomparable. But they are archivally stored vocalizations of similarly incomparable intensities, articulated perhaps poorly, but also audaciously, after the sea fades and land comes back into focus, and the lover, whomever he or she may be, is gone, but leaving in their wake not just the pain and withdrawal their absences cause, but also the messiness from distance to children that Berlado and others sought to sort out, including by assailing administrators with the impassioned complexities of their yearnings. And John, I want to conclude by saying merci pour tout, du fond du cœur. Merci.